He wrote in the shadows of candlelight, in worn-out clothes, with the weight of a collapsing world on his mind. Whether you admire him or disagree with him, Karl Marx's life was anything but boring. Tonight we'll gently drift through the life of the man behind one of the most powerful and controversial ideologies in modern history. A story filled with exile, poverty, big ideas, and a pen that challenged empires. No debates, no noise, just calm reflection as we turn the pages of a man who reimagined the structure of society while struggling to survive his own. If you find peace in unraveling the minds that shaped the world, even the loudest ones, in the quiet of night, dust, you're home here. Tap subscribe, hit the bell icon, and join our sleepy circle of late-night history lovers. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It's always a comfort to see how far these stories gently travel. In the spring of 1818, in the modest Prussian town of Trier, a child was born who would spend his entire life caught between worlds that could never quite contain him. Karl Heinrich Marx entered this world on May 5th, the oldest surviving son among 9 children, born to Heinrich and Henrietta Marx. The house at Brückengasse 1664 stood unremarkably among the narrow cobblestone streets, yet within its walls contradictions that would shape a revolutionary mind were already taking root. Heinrich Marx, Karl's father, embodied the peculiar tensions of Jewish life in early 19th century Prussia. A successful lawyer with an income that afforded the family middle-class comfort, Heinrich was a man of the Enlightenment. He read Voltaire and believed in reason, progress, and the possibility of human betterment. Yet this same man who championed intellectual freedom had been forced to abandon his Jewish faith, converting to Protestant Christianity sometime around 1817, probably because his professional career demanded it. The baptism was less about belief than about survival in a society where Jews faced systematic exclusion from public life. Karl himself was baptized at age 6, a routine ceremony that nonetheless marked him as someone who would always exist in the spaces between identities. His mother, Henrietta Pressburg, came from Holland and descended from a long line of rabbis. Both parents carried the weight of Jewish intellectual tradition, even as they were forced to practice Christian customs. This early exposure to religious hypocrisy, to the gap between public performance and private belief, would plant seeds that would later bloom into Karl's fierce critique of institutional religion. The Trier of Karl's childhood was a town where ancient Roman ruins shared space with medieval churches and Prussian administrative buildings. The city had been under French rule during the Napoleonic period and only returned to Prussian control in 1815, just 3 years before Karl's birth. This meant that his earliest years were lived in a place still adjusting to new rulers, new laws, new ways of organizing daily life. The very ground beneath his feet bore the archaeological layers of different civilizations, different ways of organizing human society. Heinrich Marx's work as a lawyer brought the family into contact with the machinery of justice, but also with its limitations and contradictions. Young Karl would have witnessed his father's frustration with legal systems that claimed to dispense impartial justice while systematically favoring the wealthy and well-connected. The law, supposedly neutral and universal, revealed itself in practice to be a tool for maintaining existing power arrangements. These observations, made in childhood but not yet articulated, would later inform Marx's understanding of how seemingly neutral institutions actually serve particular class interests. The Marx household was not wealthy, but it was comfortable, enough to afford books, and books filled their home. Heinrich believed passionately in education and intellectual development. He read German philosophy and French political theory, and he encouraged his children to think critically about the world around them. Karl grew up in conversations about Kant and Hegel, about the French Revolution and its aftermath, about the possibilities and limitations of human reason. These weren't abstract academic discussions, but urgent questions about how human beings should organize their societies. Karl's mother, Henrietta, provided a different kind of intellectual influence. Her Dutch background and rabbinical heritage brought a tradition of textual analysis, of careful reading and interpretation, of finding meaning in the careful examination of words and their relationships to each other. This scholarly approach to understanding texts would later serve Karl well as he dissected the writings of economists and philosophers, looking for the hidden assumptions and unstated contradictions that others missed. The family's financial situation was stable but not extravagant. Heinrich's income as a lawyer provided for their needs, but they were always conscious of money, always aware that their comfort depended on Heinrich's continued ability to work and earn. This middle-class anxiety about economic security, this awareness that respectability could be lost as quickly as it was gained, gave young Karl an early understanding of how individual lives were shaped by economic forces beyond personal controls. Karl entered adolescence. The contradictions of his family's position became more apparent to him. They were educated and cultured, yet they had been forced to abandon their religious heritage for economic reasons. They were comfortable, yet always vulnerable to economic uncertainty. They lived in a society that proclaimed equality before the law, yet they had experienced firsthand how legal rights could be denied or restricted based on religious or ethnic identity. These early experiences of contradiction and hypocrisy would shape Karl's lifelong suspicion of idealistic proclamations that ignored material realities. The question that would dominate Karl's adult life was already beginning to form in his mind. During these early years, why did human societies consistently fail to live up to their own stated ideals? Why did institutions that claimed to serve universal human interests actually serve the interests of particular groups? What were the hidden mechanisms that perpetuated inequality and injustice even within systems that officially proclaimed equality and justice? These questions, born from his family's experience of religious conversion and social adaptation, would drive his later revolutionary analysis of capitalism and class society. In October 1835, 17-year-old Karl Marx left the familiar confines of Trier for the University of Bonn, carrying with him his father's expectations and his own barely suppressed rebellious energy. Heinrich Marx had insisted that Karl study law, viewing it as a practical field that would provide economic security, but Karl himself was drawn to philosophy and literature, to the grand questions about human nature and social organization that had dominated his childhood conversations. The University of Bonn in the 1830s was a place where young men from middle-class families gathered to drink, duel, and occasionally study. Karl enthusiastically embraced the rebellious culture, joining both the Poets' Club, a group of political radicals that attracted police attention, and the Trier Tavern Club, a drinking society where he eventually served as co-president. The very names of these organizations reveal the twin poles of Karl's interests: poetry and politics, intellectual rebellion, and social camaraderie. The daily routine of a Bonn student was structured around lectures in the morning, social activities in the afternoon, and drinking in the evening. Karl attended law lectures as his father required, but he spent his free time reading literature and philosophy, writing poetry, and engaging in political discussions that stretched late into the night. In August 1836, he participated in a duel with a member of the university's Borussian Corps, an event that perfectly captured his willingness to fight for his principles, even when those principles were as abstract as student honor. Karl's grades during his first term were strong, but they soon deteriorated as he became more interested in the social and political dimensions of university life than in the technical details of legal study. He was discovering that the law, which his father viewed as a neutral tool for achieving justice, was actually deeply political. Legal principles that claimed universal validity were applied differently to different classes of people. Property, rights that claimed to protect individual freedom, actually protected the wealthy against the poor. The legal system that claimed to be impartial actually reinforced existing social hierarchies. His poetry from this period reveals a young man grappling with enormous questions about human purpose and social justice. The verses were ambitious and melodramatic, full of references to classical mythology and contemporary philosophy. More importantly, they showed Karl beginning to think about human beings not as isolated individuals, but as social creatures whose individual lives were shaped by the societies in which they lived. The poems were often dark, filled with images of struggle and contradiction, suggesting that Karl was already developing the tragic vision that would characterize his mature philosophy. Heinrich Marx became increasingly concerned about Karl's academic performance and his involvement in radical student politics. Letters from this period show a father trying to balance support for his son's intellectual development with concern about practical matters like grades and career prospects. Heinrich understood that Karl's political activities could have serious consequences. Students who associated with radical groups often found themselves under police surveillance, and such surveillance could damage future employment prospects. The decision to transfer Karl to the University of Berlin after just 1 year at Bonn reflected Heinrich's assessment that his son needed a more serious academic environment. Berlin was known for its rigorous intellectual culture and its philosophical sophistication, but it was also a place where Karl would encounter ideas that would prove far more dangerous to conventional thinking than anything he had discovered. In Bonn's taverns, Karl arrived in Berlin in October 1836, renting a room on Mittelstrasse and matriculating in the university's Faculty of Law. The contrast with Bonn was immediate and dramatic. Where Bonn had been provincial and relaxed, Berlin was cosmopolitan and intense. The city was the capital of Prussia, the center of German intellectual life, and the home of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich. Hegel, the philosopher whose ideas would dominate Karl's thinking for the rest of his life. During his first term, Karl attended lectures by Eduard Gans, who represented the progressive wing of Hegelian philosophy, and Karl von Savigny, who represented the historical school of law. These two professors offered completely different approaches to understanding law and society. Gans argued that legal institutions should evolve to reflect changing social needs and progressive ideals. Savigny insisted that legal institutions grew organically from the historical experience of particular peoples and could not be artificially reformed without destroying their effectiveness. This intellectual conflict between progressive reform and historical tradition forced Karl to think more systematically about the relationship between ideas and social change. Could human reason design better institutions, as the Enlightenment philosophers had claimed? Or were human institutions so deeply rooted in historical experience that rational reform was impossible? This question would drive Karl's intellectual development throughout his university years and beyond. Although he was officially studying law, Karl found himself increasingly fascinated by philosophy. During a period of convalescence in Strahlau, he joined the Doctors' Club and through them became involved with the young Hegelians in 1837. This was the moment when Karl's intellectual life took the direction that would define his adult work. The young Hegelians were a group of radical philosophers who claimed to be developing Hegel's ideas in more progressive directions, applying Hegelian dialectical method to contemporary political and religious questions. What questions were being debated in those late-night meetings that would shape the mind of the future revolutionary? What intellectual discoveries were being made in Berlin beer halls and student lodgings that would eventually transform how human beings understood their own societies? The Doctors' Club that Karl joined in 1837 was officially a society for discussing philosophical questions, but in practice it functioned as a gathering place for young intellectuals who believed that philosophy could and should change the world. The club met regularly in Berlin beer halls where members would spend hours debating abstract philosophical questions that had immediate political implications. For Karl, these meetings represented his first sustained exposure to the idea that intellectual work was not separate from political action, but rather the foundation for effective political action. The dominant figure in these discussions was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, even though Hegel himself had died in 1831. Hegel's philosophical system offered a way of understanding history as a rational process of development in which contradictions within existing institutions inevitably led to their transformation into higher forms. The young Hegelians drew on Hegel's idea that the purpose and promise of history was the total negation of everything conducive to restricting freedom and reason. This meant that criticism of existing institutions was not merely negative, but actually contributed to historical progress by revealing contradictions that would eventually be resolved through social transformation. Karl's engagement with Hegelian philosophy provided him with a systematic method for analyzing social institutions and their historical development. Instead of simply accepting existing arrangements as natural or inevitable, Hegelian method encouraged critical examination of how institutions had developed historically and what contradictions within them might lead to future changes. This approach appealed to Karl because it combined rigorous intellectual analysis with the possibility of radical social change. The young Hegelians believed that their philosophical criticism of religion and politics constituted a form of practical activity that would contribute to social progress. By exposing the contradictions within existing institutions, by showing how apparently universal principles actually served particular interests, by revealing the gap between institutional claims and institutional practice, philosophical criticism could help create the intellectual conditions for social transformation. During his years in the Doctors' Club, Karl developed the intellectual habits that would characterize his mature work. He learned to read texts not just for their explicit content, but for their unstated assumptions and hidden contradictions. He learned to analyze social institutions not as isolated phenomena, but as parts of larger systems that developed according to historical laws. Most importantly, he learned to combine theoretical analysis with practical political engagement to see philosophical work as preparation for revolutionary action. Karl's doctoral dissertation, completed in 1841, examined the differences between the philosophical systems of Democritus and Epicurus, two ancient Greek materialist philosophers. The dissertation focused on Epicurus's concept of the swerve, the idea that atoms sometimes deviate from their predetermined paths, creating the possibility for freedom within a deterministic universe. This seemingly abstract philosophical question actually addressed one of the central political questions of the era, whether human beings could consciously shape their historical development or whether they were simply products of forces beyond their control. The choice to write about ancient philosophy rather than contemporary politics reflected the constraints under which German intellectuals operated in the 1840s. Direct political criticism could result in censorship, imprisonment, or exile, but philosophical criticism of ancient systems could address contemporary questions indirectly. Karl's dissertation was simultaneously a piece of classical scholarship and a contribution to contemporary debates about freedom, determinism, and the possibility of revolutionary change. Karl received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Jena in 1841, but by then his interests had shifted decisively away from academic philosophy toward political journalism and social criticism. The young Hegelian movement was evolving in more radical directions, and Karl was increasingly convinced that philosophical criticism needed to be combined with practical political action to achieve social transformation. His friendship with Bruno Bauer, one of the leading young Hegelian theologians, had introduced Karl to the idea that criticism of religion was the foundation for criticism of politics. Bauer argued that religious consciousness was the primary obstacle to human liberation because it encouraged people to accept earthly suffering in exchange for promises of heavenly reward. By exposing the human origins of religious ideas, philosophical criticism could help people understand that their social conditions were not divinely ordained, but historically created and therefore historically changeable. Karl's engagement with Bauer's religious criticism led him to develop his own analysis of the relationship between religious consciousness and political oppression. He began to see religion not simply as a collection of false beliefs, but as a social institution that served specific political functions. Religious ideas helped legitimate existing social hierarchies by presenting them as reflections of divine will. Religious practices channeled popular discontent into harmless ritual activities rather than political action. Religious institutions provided ideological support for political authorities while claiming to represent universal rather than particular interests. This analysis of religion as social criticism marked Karl's transition from abstract philosophical speculation to concrete analysis of contemporary institutions. He was beginning to develop the methodological approach that would characterize his mature work, the systematic examination of how apparently universal institutions actually served particular class interests, and how the gap between institutional claims and institutional practice created contradictions that could become sources of revolutionary change. The question that dominated Karl's thinking as he completed his university education was how to transform philosophical criticism into practical political action. The young Hegelians had developed powerful tools for analyzing social contradictions, but they had not yet found effective ways to translate their analysis into social change. This question would drive Karl's work throughout the 1840s as he moved from philosophical criticism to political journalism to revolutionary organizing. By 1841, Karl had completed his formal education, but his real education in revolution was just beginning. The comfortable world of university philosophy was about to give way to the harsh realities of political exile, economic hardship, and the practical challenges of organizing social change. The ideas he had developed in Berlin, beer halls would soon be tested in the streets of Paris, Brussels, and London. The transformation from university philosopher to political journalist began for Karl Marx in October 1842, when he became editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal newspaper based in Cologne. At 24, Karl found himself responsible for a publication that served as a voice for the progressive bourgeoisie of the Rhineland, merchants and industrialists who chafed under Prussian bureaucratic restrictions. The position offered him his first sustained contact with practical political questions, forcing him to move beyond abstract philosophical speculation to concrete analysis of contemporary social problems. The daily routine of a newspaper editor was utterly different from the leisurely pace of university life. Karl had to produce articles on deadline, respond to current events as they unfolded, and navigate the complex political pressures that came from readers, advertisers, and government censors. The Prussian government maintained strict control over the press, requiring all articles to be submitted to censors before publication. This meant that Karl had to learn how to communicate radical ideas in language that could pass official scrutiny, while still conveying critical analysis to readers who understood the coded references. His articles during this period reveal a mind grappling with the practical implications of philosophical ideas. When he wrote about laws restricting the gathering of wood by poor peasants, he was forced to analyze how abstract principles of property rights operated in concrete social situations. When he wrote about press censorship, he had to examine how claims about universal reason and free speech actually functioned within systems of political power. These articles marked Karl's discovery that philosophical criticism was most powerful when it was grounded in careful analysis of specific social institutions and their effects on particular groups of people. The Rheinische Zeitung attracted attention from government authorities precisely because it applied philosophical criticism to contemporary political questions. Karl's articles on economic questions particularly worried censors because they suggested that existing property arrangements were not natural or inevitable, but historically contingent and potentially changeable. His analysis of how legal institutions served the interests of property owners while claiming to protect universal rights revealed contradictions within liberal political theory that threatened the ideological foundations of the existing order. Karl's personal life during this period was also undergoing dramatic changes. In June 1843, after an engagement of 7 years, he married Jenny von Westphalen, the daughter of a prominent local family whose social position complicated Karl's growing radicalism. Jenny was 4 years older than Karl, intelligent and well-educated, but her family background represented exactly the kind of aristocratic privilege that Karl's political analysis was beginning to criticize. Her half-brother would later become a highly reactionary Prussian minister, making family gatherings exercises in diplomatic restraint. The marriage to Jenny represented both personal happiness and political commitment. Jenny understood that her marriage to Karl meant accepting a life of economic uncertainty and political controversy. Her father, influenced by French socialist thought, supported the match, but other family members viewed Karl's radical politics with suspicion and concern. For Karl, the marriage represented validation that his political commitments were compatible with personal relationships based on mutual respect and intellectual partnership. The Prussian government's pressure on the Rheinische Zeitung increased throughout 1842 and early 1843 as Karl's articles became more explicitly critical of existing institutions. Censors began rejecting articles that had previously been acceptable, and government officials made clear that the newspaper's continued existence depended on moderating its political stance. Karl found himself caught between his commitment to radical analysis and his responsibility to keep the newspaper operating and its employees paid. The decision to resign from the Rheinische Zeitung in March 1843 marked Karl's recognition that effective political criticism was incompatible with the constraints of legal journalism within the Prussian system. Rather than compromise his analysis to satisfy censors, he chose to seek new venues for his work. This decision represented a crucial moment in his development as a revolutionary thinker, the moment when he acknowledged that his intellectual work was necessarily in conflict with existing political authorities. Karl's experience as a newspaper editor had taught him that philosophical criticism gained power when it was connected to concrete social analysis and practical political action. Abstract speculation about human nature and historical development became meaningful only when it illuminated specific institutional arrangements and their effects on particular groups of people. The articles he had written about wood gathering, laws and press censorship had shown him how systematic analysis of seemingly minor legal questions could reveal fundamental contradictions within entire political systems. The months between his resignation from the Rheinische Zeitung and his departure for Paris were spent in intensive study and writing. Karl was developing the theoretical framework that would guide his subsequent political analysis, drawing on his philosophical training while incorporating insights gained from his practical experience as a journalist. He was beginning to formulate the questions that would drive his mature work. How do economic relationships shape political institutions? How do systems of property ownership affect social consciousness? How can philosophical criticism contribute to practical revolutionary action? The decision to leave Germany for Paris represented Karl's recognition that his intellectual development required freedom from Prussian censorship and access to the broader intellectual currents of European radical thought. Paris in the 1840s was home to exiled revolutionaries from across Europe, a place where ideas that were suppressed elsewhere could be freely discussed and developed. For Karl, the move to Paris meant the opportunity to test his emerging ideas in dialogue with other radical thinkers and to participate in political movements that were explicitly committed to revolutionary change. What would Karl discover in the revolutionary atmosphere of Paris that would transform his philosophical criticism into a systematic theory of social transformation? How would his encounter with French socialism and German exile politics shape his understanding of the relationship between ideas and revolutionary action? Karl and Jenny Marx arrived in Paris in October 1843, settling initially into lodgings at 23 Rue Vanneau, sharing space with Arnold Ruger, Karl's co-editor, on their new publication, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher. The cramped quarters and communal living arrangements reflected their limited financial resources, but they also placed Karl at the center of the German exile community, where revolutionary ideas circulated with an intensity impossible under Prussian censorship. The daily rhythm of life in exile was both liberating and precarious. Karl could write freely for the first time in his adult life, but this freedom came at the cost of economic security and social respectability. The Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher was intended to bridge German philosophical sophistication with French political radicalism, creating a synthesis that would advance revolutionary theory throughout Europe. Karl threw himself into this project with characteristic intensity, working long hours in their shared lodgings while Jenny managed the practical details of their daily life. Karl's major contributions to the journal were two essays that marked his transition from philosophical criticism to political analysis: Introduction to a Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right and On the Jewish Question. These essays represented Karl's attempt to apply Hegelian dialectical method to contemporary political questions, examining how abstract philosophical principles operated within concrete social institutions. The essays were dense, theoretical, and uncompromising in their criticism of existing arrangements. The introduction contained Karl's famous formulation that religion is the opium of the people, but this phrase, often quoted out of context, was actually part of a complex analysis of how religious consciousness both reflected and perpetuated social oppression. Karl argued that religious ideas arose from real social contradictions and provided genuine comfort to people suffering under unjust conditions, but that religious solutions to social problems were ultimately illusory and prevented people from addressing the real sources of their suffering. Only one issue of the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher was published before the project collapsed, due to financial difficulties and political disagreements between Karl and Ruger. The failure was both disappointing and instructive. Karl learned that revolutionary publications required not only theoretical sophistication, but also practical organization, financial support, and political constituencies capable of sustaining long-term political work. After the journal's collapse, Karl began writing for Vorwärts, a German-language newspaper published in Paris that served the exile community. His articles for Vorwärts showed him developing a more systematic analysis of the relationship between economic conditions and political consciousness. He was beginning to argue that philosophical criticism, while necessary, was insufficient for revolutionary change. Revolutionary theory needed to identify the social forces capable of implementing revolutionary practice. The birth of their daughter, Jenny, in May 1844, added new dimensions to Karl and Jenny's life in exile. The practical challenges of caring for an infant in their cramped lodgings forced them to move to separate accommodations, but it also deepened their commitment to creating a world in which their children could live with dignity and freedom. Karl's political analysis was no longer abstract but personal, motivated by his desire to create better conditions for his own family and for families throughout Europe. The meeting with Friedrich Engels on August 28, 1844 at the Café de la Régence marked the beginning of the most important intellectual partnership in Karl's life. Engels had been developing his own analysis of working-class conditions in Manchester, where his family's textile business had given him first-hand observation of industrial capitalism's effects on workers and their families. The conversation between Karl and Engels lasted for days as they discovered that their separate analyses of German philosophy and English industry pointed toward the same conclusions about the need for revolutionary transformation. Engels brought to their partnership practical knowledge of how capitalism operated as an economic system, while Karl brought sophisticated theoretical tools for analyzing capitalism's contradictions and historical development. Their collaboration began immediately with work on the Holy Family, a critique of Bruno Bauer and other young Hegelians who remained trapped in abstract philosophical speculation. The book marked Karl's definitive break with purely philosophical approaches to social criticism. Karl's daily routine during his Paris period involved intensive reading and writing, often working through the night, while Jenny managed their household and cared for their infant daughter. He was reading voraciously in political economy, studying Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and other classical economists whose work provided the foundation for understanding capitalism as a historical system. His notebooks from this period, later published as the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, show him developing the concept of alienated labor that would become central to his mature analysis. The manuscripts reveal Karl working through complex questions about human nature and social organization. He was trying to understand why people in capitalist societies felt disconnected from their work, their products, their fellow workers, and their own human potential. His analysis of alienation provided a bridge between philosophical concerns about human self-realization and economic analysis of how capitalism organized production and distribution. Karl's political activity in Paris brought him to the attentions of Prussian authorities who pressured the French government to expel troublesome German exiles. The expulsion order came in February 1845, forcing Karl and Jenny to pack their few possessions and seek refuge elsewhere. The pattern of exile and expulsion that would characterize their lives for the next several years was beginning to establish itself. The move to Brussels in February 1845 represented another stage in Karl's political development, as he was forced to sign an agreement promising not to publish on contemporary politics. This restriction pushed him toward more theoretical work and deeper collaboration with Engels, who joined him in Brussels in April 1845. Their work together would produce the German ideology, their most systematic statement of historical materialism, and their first attempt to outline a comprehensive theory of social development. But what theoretical breakthroughs would emerge from their collaboration in Brussels? How would their combined analysis of German philosophy and English industry create the foundation for a new understanding of history and revolution? Brussels in 1845 was a haven for political exiles from across Europe, a constitutional monarchy with relatively liberal press laws that attracted revolutionaries who had been expelled from more repressive regimes. Karl and Jenny settled into modest lodgings and began the life of permanent exile that would characterize their remaining years. The restriction on publishing contemporary politics freed Karl to focus on theoretical work, while forcing him to develop indirect methods for communicating revolutionary ideas. Engels joined Karl in Brussels in April 1845, bringing with him Mary Burns, his Irish working-class partner, whose first-hand knowledge of industrial conditions complemented Engels's business experience. The four adults formed an unconventional household that combined intellectual work with political organizing, domestic partnership with revolutionary commitment. Their daily life reflected their political values as they rejected bourgeois conventions about marriage and family while creating their own forms of intimate community. Karl's daily routine in Brussels involved intensive writing sessions that often lasted from morning until late evening, with breaks for meals shared with Jenny, Engels, and Mary. Their lodgings became a meeting place for German exiles and local Belgian radicals, where theoretical discussions merged with practical organizing. Work. Karl was learning to balance solitary intellectual work with collaborative political activity, developing ideas through conversation and testing theories against other people's experiences. The collaborative work on the German ideology began in the summer of 1845 and continued through the following year, producing over 700 pages of manuscript that would not be published until the 1930s. The book represented Karl and Engels' most systematic attempt to outline their materialist conception of history, their understanding of how economic relationships shaped political and cultural institutions across different historical periods. The German ideology marked Karl's definitive break with philosophical approaches that began with abstract concepts about human nature or historical development. Instead, Karl and Engels argued that historical analysis should begin with examination of how people produced their material subsistence under specific technological and social conditions. The organization of production shaped all other aspects of social life, including political institutions, cultural forms, and individual consciousness. This materialist method provided powerful tools for analyzing contemporary capitalism and predicting its future development. Instead of treating capitalism as a natural or eternal system, Karl and Engels understood it as a historically specific form of social organization that had emerged under particular conditions and would eventually be superseded by new forms of organization that resolved capitalism's internal contradictions. In July 1845, Karl and Engels traveled to England to study working-class conditions and meet with Chartist leaders who were organizing for democratic political reforms. The trip provided Karl with his first direct observation of industrial capitalism's most advanced form, confirming theoretical insights with empirical evidence about how capitalist development affected workers and their families. Karl's research in Manchester and London libraries during this period laid the foundation for his later economic analysis. He was systematically studying British government reports on working conditions, factory legislation, and trade union activity, accumulating the detailed empirical evidence that would support his theoretical arguments. The combination of philosophical sophistication with empirical research distinguished Karl's approach from both abstract theorizing and mere factual description. The writing of The Poverty of Philosophy in 1847 represented Karl's first systematic engagement with contemporary economic theory, specifically Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's What is Property? Karl's critique of Proudhon showed him developing the analytical tools that would characterize his mature economic work, examining how apparently scientific economic theories actually reflected particular class perspectives and political commitments. Karl's analysis of Proudhon revealed that economic theories were not neutral descriptions of natural laws, but ideological justifications for particular forms of social organization. By exposing the class content of economic ideas, Karl was developing methods for analyzing how intellectual production served political functions within broader systems of social domination. The reorganization of the League of the Just into the Communist League in June 1847 marked Karl's entry into practical revolutionary organizing on an international scale. The League brought together radical workers and intellectuals from across Europe who were committed to revolutionary transformation of existing social arrangements. Karl's involvement required him to translate theoretical insights into political programs that could guide practical organizing work. The writing of the Communist Manifesto in late 1847 and early 1848 represented the culmination of Karl's theoretical development during his Brussels period. Written in collaboration with Engels, the manifesto was intended as a practical document that would clarify the Communist League's political positions and rally support for revolutionary action. The text combined theoretical sophistication with rhetorical power, analytical precision with passionate commitment to social transformation. The manifesto's famous opening declaration that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles summarized the materialist conception of history that Karl and Engels had developed through their collaborative work. History was driven not by the development of ideas or the actions of great individuals, but by conflicts between social classes with opposing economic interests. Karl's daily life during the writing of the manifesto involved intensive collaboration with Engels as they worked together to craft language that would be accessible to working-class readers while maintaining analytical rigor. Jenny copied and edited their drafts, contributing to both the intellectual and practical work of revolutionary organizing. Their household had become a workshop for revolutionary theory and practice. The publication of the manifesto in February 1848 coincided with the outbreak of revolutionary movements across Europe, as workers and democratic movements challenged existing political arrangements from Paris to Vienna to Berlin. Karl and Engels found themselves in the extraordinary position of having developed theoretical tools for understanding revolutionary processes, just as those processes were beginning to unfold across the continent. But the revolutions of 1848 would also expose the gap between revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice, forcing Karl to confront the complex relationship between intellectual analysis and political action. The events that would unfold across Europe in 1848 and 1849 would test everything that Karl and Engels had learned about class struggle and historical development, leading to discoveries that would reshape their understanding of how revolutionary change actually occurred in practice. The comfortable world of exile politics and theoretical work was about to give way to the harsh realities of revolutionary failure and the long, difficult process of building movements capable of sustained political action. Karl's education in revolution was about to enter a new and more challenging phase, one that would ultimately drive him toward the comprehensive analysis of capitalism that would become his life's work. In August 1849, Karl Marx arrived in London as a political refugee, carrying little more than the clothes on his back and the weight of revolutionary failure across Europe. The revolutions of 1848 had collapsed with stunning speed, leaving thousands of political activists scattered across the continent as exiles and refugees. For Karl, now 31 years old, London represented both sanctuary and defeat, a place where he could safely continue his work, but also a reminder that the revolutionary transformation he had predicted and worked toward had failed to materialize. Jenny was pregnant with their fourth child when they made the crossing from Calais to Dover, a journey that marked the beginning of what would become their permanent exile from the German-speaking world. The family's financial situation was desperate, as Karl had no regular source of income and few prospects for employment in a country where he barely spoke the language. Their first lodgings were in a cramped boarding house in Chelsea, where they shared 2 small rooms with their 3 surviving children and whatever possessions they had managed to salvage from their hasty departure from Cologne. London, in 1849, was the largest city in the world, a sprawling metropolis of over 2 million people that served as the commercial and financial center of an empire spanning the globe. The contrast with the provincial German cities where Karl had spent his adult life was overwhelming. The scale of industrial production, the concentration of wealth and poverty, the sheer complexity of economic relationships, all of this provided Karl with a living laboratory for studying capitalism in its most advanced form. The daily routines of exile life were shaped by constant financial anxiety. Karl had no professional credentials that English employers would recognize, no social connections that could provide introductions to potential work. His German law degree was worthless in the English legal system, and his reputation as a radical journalist made him unemployable in mainstream publications. The family survived on small loans from political sympathizers and occasional payments for articles written for German exile publications. Jenny's role during these early months in London was crucial to the family's survival. She managed their meagre resources with extraordinary skill, stretching every penny to cover rent, food, and the basic necessities of daily life. Her aristocratic background had not prepared her for such poverty, but she adapted with remarkable resilience, learning to bargain with shopkeepers to prepare simple meals from cheap ingredients, and to maintain some semblance of normal family life under extremely difficult circumstances. The birth of their son Guido in November 1849 added another mouth to feed, but also another source of joy in their difficult circumstances. Karl was a devoted father who found in his children's laughter a respite from the political disappointments and financial anxieties that dominated his daily life. He would spend hours telling them stories, teaching them games, and explaining the world around them with the same careful attention he brought to his theoretical work. Karl's political analysis during this period was deeply influenced by his attempt to understand why the revolutions of 1848 had failed so completely. He began developing a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between economic conditions and political consciousness, recognizing that revolutionary situations required not just widespread discontent, but also the development of organized political movements capable of sustained action. The establishment of contact with other German exiles in London provided Karl with both political companionship and intellectual stimulation. The exile community met regularly in pubs and coffee houses where they debated the lessons of revolutionary failure and planned for future political action. These discussions were often contentious, as different factions blamed each other for tactical mistakes and strategic errors that had contributed to the defeat of democratic movements across Europe. Karl's involvement in the Communist League continued during his early years in London, but he was increasingly skeptical about the organization's effectiveness. The League was divided by factional disputes and hampered by the geographic dispersion of its members. Karl began to argue that revolutionary organizing required more systematic theoretical preparation and better understanding of the economic forces that shaped political development. The family's move to Dean Street in Soho in late 1850 marked their descent into the deepest poverty they would experience during their London years. The two-room apartment at 28 Dean Street housed Karl, Jenny, and their children in conditions that shocked even sympathetic visitors. The rooms were small, poorly heated and furnished with only the most basic necessities. Karl's desk occupied much of the space in their living room, surrounded by stacks of books and papers that represented his ongoing research into economic theory. The daily routine at Dean Street was structured around Karl's writing schedule and the family's survival needs. Karl would work through the morning writing articles for German exile publications, while Jenny managed the household and cared for the children. Afternoons were often spent at the British Museum, where Karl had discovered the reading room and its extraordinary collection of economic and historical materials. The British Museum Reading Room, which had opened in 1857, became Karl's daily workplace and intellectual sanctuary. His routine was remarkably consistent. He would arrive when the reading room opened at 9 in the morning and remain until it closed at 7 in the evening. This schedule provided structure to his days and escape from the cramped conditions at home, while giving him access to research materials that were unavailable anywhere else in the world. Karl's research methods during this period were exhaustive and systematic. He would fill notebook after notebook with excerpts from economic texts, government reports, and historical studies, building the empirical foundation for his theoretical analysis. His handwriting was small and precise, cramming as much information as possible onto each page, reflecting both his intellectual thoroughness and his awareness that paper and ink were expensive luxuries. The death of their infant son Guido in November 1850 devastated the family and marked the beginning of a series of personal tragedies that would shadow their London years. The child had been sickly since birth, and the poor living conditions at Dean Street had made recovery impossible. Karl and Jenny blamed themselves for their inability to provide the medical care and healthy environment that might have saved their son's life. What sustained Karl through these dark months was his growing conviction that his theoretical work was making genuine progress toward understanding capitalism's fundamental contradictions. How would his daily research in the British Museum reading room gradually evolve into the comprehensive analysis that would become Das Kapital? Karl's daily journey from Dean Street to the British Museum reading room became as regular as clockwork, a routine that provided both escape from domestic hardship and immersion in the intellectual work that gave meaning to his exile. The reading room was a sanctuary of quiet concentration where scholars from around the world gathered to pursue research that required access to one of the world's greatest libraries. For Karl, seat number G7 became his office, his laboratory, and his refuge. The reading room's circular design, with its massive dome and radiating desks, created an atmosphere of scholarly solemnity that matched Karl's sense of intellectual mission. He would arrive each morning carrying a small bag containing notebooks, pencils, and whatever food Jenny had been able to prepare for his lunch. The ritual of settling into his assigned seat, arranging his materials, and requesting his first batch of books from the library staff marked the beginning of each day's intellectual work. Karl's research during the early 1850s was extraordinarily wide-ranging, encompassing economic theory, industrial history, government reports on working conditions, and philosophical analysis of capitalism's cultural effects. By 1857, he had accumulated over 800 pages of notes and short essays on capital, landed property, wage labor, and related topics. This massive collection of materials would eventually provide the foundation for Das Kapital, but during the 1850s, it represented Karl's attempt to understand capitalism as a total system affecting every aspect of human social life. The financial crisis that began in 1857 provided Karl with a real-time laboratory for testing his theoretical insights against actual economic developments. He followed the crisis obsessively, reading multiple newspapers daily and corresponding with Engels about the implications of particular economic events. The crisis seemed to confirm Karl's analysis that capitalism was inherently unstable, subject to periodic crises that grew more severe as the system developed. Karl's work on what would later be called the Grundrisse began during the crisis, as he attempted to organize his accumulated research into a systematic analysis of capitalism's fundamental laws of development. The Grundrisse manuscripts, which eventually totaled over 1,000 pages, represented Karl's most sustained attempt to think through the logical structure of capitalist production and its historical implications. The work was written at fever pitch as Karl struggled to capture insights that seemed to emerge faster than he could record them. The contrast between Karl's intellectual productivity and his family's deteriorating living conditions created constant tension during this period. While he was developing revolutionary insights into capitalism's inner workings, Jenny was pawning their few remaining possessions to pay for food and rent. The irony was not lost on either of them. Karl was analyzing the mechanisms of economic exploitation while experiencing its effects in his daily life. Jenny's letters from this period reveal the strain of managing a household on virtually no income while supporting Karl's research. She had to negotiate with landlords for extensions on rent payments, convince shopkeepers to provide credit for basic necessities, and somehow maintain morale within the family despite their increasingly desperate circumstances. Her aristocratic background, which had once been a source of embarrassment for Karl's radical politics, now proved invaluable as she used her social skills to manage creditors and extract assistance from reluctant sympathizers. The death of their infant son Edgar in April 1855, plunged the family into grief that was compounded by their inability to afford proper medical care or a decent burial. Karl blamed capitalism for his son's death, seeing in this personal tragedy a reflection of the system's callous disregard for human welfare. The loss strengthened his determination to complete his economic analysis, but it also deepened his understanding of how economic forces affected the most intimate aspects of human experience. Karl's work as European correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune, which began in 1852, provided the family's most reliable source of income during this period. The arrangement, facilitated by Engels's connections, required Karl to produce articles twice weekly on European political and economic developments. Initially, Wilhelm Pieper translated Karl's German articles into English, but eventually Karl developed sufficient command of English to write directly for American readers. The Tribune work forced Karl to develop skills as a popular journalist while maintaining his analytical rigor. His articles on topics ranging from British foreign policy to European labor movements had to be accessible to American readers while providing sophisticated analysis of complex political and economic developments. This work taught Karl to communicate theoretical insights through concrete analysis of current events, a skill that would prove valuable in his later theoretical writings. The economic recession of 1857 led to reduced demand for Karl's Tribune articles, cutting the family's income just as Jenny was pregnant with their daughter, Eleanor. The financial pressure was enormous, as they faced the prospect of eviction from their Dean Street lodgings without prospects for alternative income. Karl's health began to suffer under the stress as he developed the skin conditions and other ailments that would plague him for the rest of his life. Engels's decision to provide regular financial support to the Marx family marked a turning point in their relationship and in Karl's ability to continue his theoretical work. Engels had taken a position in his family's Manchester textile business, specifically to generate income that could support Karl's research. This arrangement allowed Karl to reduce his journalism work and focus more intensively on his economic analysis. The collaboration between Karl and Engels during this period extended far beyond financial support. Engels provided industrial expertise and business experience that complemented Karl's theoretical sophistication. Their correspondence shows Engels contributing detailed knowledge of production processes, market conditions, and business practices that helped Karl understand how abstract economic categories operated in actual industrial settings. Karl's research methodology during the 1850s involved systematic comparison of theoretical works with empirical evidence drawn from government reports, business publications, and historical studies. He was particularly interested in British government reports on factory conditions, which provided detailed documentation of how industrial capitalism affected workers' lives. These reports, produced by factory inspectors and parliamentary committees, offered quantitative data that could test theoretical predictions against measurable outcomes. The scope of Karl's research expanded constantly as he discovered new connections between seemingly separate economic phenomena. His notebooks from this period show him tracing relationships between international trade, domestic production, technological development, and class formation. Each new insight seemed to require investigation of additional topics, creating an ever-expanding web of research questions that threatened to overwhelm any possibility of completing a finished work. How would Karl transform this massive accumulation of research into the systematic presentation that would become Das Kapital? What methodological breakthroughs would allow him to organize his insights into a coherent analysis that could guide revolutionary practice? The move from Dean Street to a larger house at 9 Grafton Terrace in 1856 marked a modest improvement in the Marx family's living conditions, made possible by an inheritance Jenny received when her mother died. The new house provided Karl with a proper study where he could organize his research materials and work without the constant interruptions that had characterized life in their cramped Soho lodgings. For the first time in years, Karl had space to spread out his notebooks and books, to visualize the connections between different aspects of his research. The study at Grafton Terrace became the workshop where Das Kapital took shape. Karl arranged his workspace with meticulous care, grouping his notebooks by topic and creating filing systems that allowed him to locate specific references quickly. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing the economic and historical works that formed the foundation of his analysis. His desk was positioned to catch natural light from the window, where he could work during the day before moving to artificial light for evening writing sessions. Karl's daily routine during the composition of Das Kapital was structured around long periods of uninterrupted writing, punctuated by research sessions at the British Museum. He would begin each morning by reviewing the previous day's work, making revisions and additions before moving on to new sections. The writing process was slow and painstaking, as Karl struggled to present complex theoretical arguments in language that would be accessible to educated readers without sacrificing analytical precision. The first volume of Das Kapital, published in 1867, represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of research and analysis. The book's organization reflected Karl's understanding that effective revolutionary theory required systematic presentation of capitalism's fundamental contradictions. The volume began with analysis of commodities and exchange, moved through examination of production processes, and concluded with analysis of capital accumulation and its historical implications. Karl's approach to writing Das Kapital was remarkably methodical. He would draft sections multiple times, constantly revising his presentation to clarify complex arguments and strengthen connections between different parts of his analysis. The manuscripts show evidence of extensive revision, with entire chapters reorganized as Karl discovered more effective ways to present his theoretical insights. The labor theory of value, which provided the foundation for Karl's analysis of capitalist exploitation, required particularly careful presentation. Karl needed to explain how commodities could exchange at their values while still generating profits for capitalists, a puzzle that had confounded earlier economists. His solution, the distinction between labor and labor power, was theoretically elegant but required detailed explanation to make it accessible to readers unfamiliar with economic theory. Karl's analysis of the working day, which occupied a central chapter in Das Kapital, drew heavily on the government reports he had studied in the British Museum reading room. He used factory inspectors' reports to document how capitalists extended working hours and intensified production processes to increase surplus value. These empirical examples transformed abstract theoretical arguments into concrete documentation of how capitalism affected workers' daily lives. The writing of Das Kapital was interrupted repeatedly by Karl's health problems, which were exacerbated by his sedentary research habits and the stress of financial insecurity. He suffered from liver problems, skin conditions, and other ailments that forced him to take breaks from his work, just when he felt he was making theoretical breakthroughs. Jenny often served as his secretary during these periods, taking dictation. When Karl was too ill to write, but still able to think through complex arguments, Engels played a crucial role in the completion and publication of Das Kapital, providing both financial support and intellectual collaboration. When Karl became bogged down in particular theoretical problems, Engels would suggest alternative approaches or provide practical examples that clarified abstract concepts. Their correspondence shows Engels encouraging Karl to complete sections. Rather than pursuing endless revision, understanding that publication was more important than perfection. The reception of Das Kapital's first volume was initially limited, as few reviewers possessed the theoretical sophistication necessary to understand Karl's arguments. However, the book gradually gained recognition among socialists and labor activists who found in Karl's analysis tools for understanding their own experiences of exploitation and struggle. The book's influence grew slowly but steadily as readers discovered that Karl's theoretical insights illuminated practical questions about wages, working conditions, and political organization. Karl's work on the second and third volumes of Das Kapital continued throughout the 1870s, but these volumes remained unfinished at his death. The manuscripts show Karl grappling with increasingly complex questions about the relationship between production and circulation, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and the role of credit and finance in capitalist development. These theoretical problems required synthesis of his earlier analysis with new research into contemporary economic developments. The establishment of the International Workingmen's Association in 1864 provided Karl with opportunities to apply his theoretical insights to practical questions of working-class organization. His involvement in the International required him to translate complex theoretical arguments into political positions that could guide concrete organizing work. This experience taught Karl about the challenges of connecting revolutionary theory with revolutionary practice. Karl's analysis of the Paris Commune in 1871 marked another important development in his thinking about revolutionary strategy and tactics. The Commune provided the first historical example of workers actually taking political power, offering empirical evidence about how revolutionary transformation might occur in practice. Karl's writings on the Commune showed him developing more nuanced understanding of the relationship between economic analysis and political action. Family life at Grafton Terrace provided Karl with personal happiness that balanced the intellectual demands of his theoretical work. His daughters, Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor, grew into intellectually sophisticated young women who shared their father's political commitments while developing their own interests in literature, theatre, and social reform. Karl delighted in their accomplishments and took pride in their independent thinking. Jenny's role as Karl's intellectual partner became more prominent during the Grafton Terrace years as she helped organize his research materials and provided editorial assistance with his writing. Her contributions to Das Kapital, while rarely acknowledged in published sources, were essential to the book's completion. She understood Karl's theoretical arguments well enough to identify inconsistencies and suggest improvements in presentation. The question that would dominate Karl's final years was whether his theoretical analysis could contribute to practical revolutionary movements that were emerging across Europe and North America. How would the ideas developed in the isolation of exile and the scholarly atmosphere of the British Museum reading room connect with the real struggles of workers organizing for better conditions and political power? By the early 1870s, Karl Marx had settled into the rhythm of an aging intellectual whose revolutionary energy was increasingly channeled through writing rather than direct political action. At 54, his health was declining noticeably, the result of decades of poor living conditions, financial stress, and intensive intellectual work. His skin condition, which doctors never successfully diagnosed or treated, caused him constant discomfort and sometimes prevented him from writing for weeks at a time. The Marx family's financial situation had stabilized somewhat by this period, thanks to Engels's continued support and occasional inheritances from Jenny's family. They were able to maintain their house at Grafton Terrace and live with a degree of comfort that had been impossible during their early London years. Karl could afford to buy books rather than relying entirely on the British Museum, and Jenny could hire domestic help to manage the household tasks that had once consumed her entire day. Karl's daily routine during this period was shaped by his declining energy and his determination to complete the remaining volumes of Das Kapital. He would work intensively for several hours each morning when his energy was highest, then spend afternoons reading or corresponding with political associates across Europe. His correspondence from this period shows him following political developments in Germany, France, and Russia with keen interest, analyzing how his theoretical predictions were being confirmed or challenged by actual events. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 and the subsequent Paris Commune provided Karl with opportunities to apply his theoretical analysis to contemporary political developments. His writings on these events showed his continued ability to synthesize complex political analysis with passionate commitment to revolutionary change. The Commune particularly excited Karl because it seemed to demonstrate that workers could indeed seize political power and begin reorganizing society along socialist lines. Karl's analysis of the Paris Commune revealed important developments in his thinking about revolutionary strategy. Unlike his earlier writings, which had focused primarily on economic analysis, his Commune writings addressed practical questions about how revolutionary governments should organize production, education, and political administration. These writings showed Karl grappling with the transition from critique of existing society to blueprint for alternative arrangements. The growth of socialist movements across Europe during the 1870s provided Karl with evidence that his theoretical work was having practical political effects. German social democrats, French socialists, and Russian revolutionaries were reading Das Kapital and finding in it tools for understanding their own political situations. Karl corresponded regularly with political leaders who sought his advice on tactical questions and theoretical problems. Karl's daughters had grown into accomplished young women whose own political and intellectual activities provided him with great satisfaction. Jenny Caroline became a journalist and political activist. Laura married Paul Lafargue and became involved in French socialist politics, and Eleanor developed interests in theatre and literature while maintaining strong socialist commitments. Karl delighted in their independence and encouraged their intellectual development even when their interests diverged from his own. Jenny's health was also declining during this period, as she suffered from the liver problems that would eventually cause her death. Her illness was probably related to the stress and poor nutrition of their early London years, but it was exacerbated by her continued anxiety about Karl's health and their family's financial security. Karl was devoted to Jenny's care, spending hours reading to her and managing household tasks when she was too ill to work. Karl's research during the 1870s expanded beyond European capitalism to include studies of non-European societies and their potential for revolutionary development. He was particularly interested in Russian social conditions, corresponding with Russian revolutionaries, and learning Russian in order to read government reports and revolutionary literature in the original language. This research suggested that Karl was developing more nuanced understanding of how socialist transformation might occur in societies with different economic and political structures. The critique of the Gotha program, which Karl wrote in 1875, revealed his continued engagement with practical questions of socialist organization. The document showed Karl's frustration with German social democrats who seemed willing to compromise their theoretical understanding for short-term political advantages. Karl insisted that effective political action required clear theoretical understanding of capitalism's contradictions and socialism's possibilities. Karl's work on the second and third volumes of Das Kapital continued throughout the 1870s, but progress was slow and often interrupted by health problems. The manuscripts show Karl struggling with increasingly complex theoretical questions about the relationship between production and circulation, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and the role of finance capital in capitalist development. These problems required synthesis of his earlier analysis with new research into contemporary economic developments. Engels's role in Karl's life became even more important during this period, as he provided not only financial support, but also intellectual collaboration and personal companionship. Their friendship had deepened over 3 decades of shared political work, and Engels understood Karl's theoretical project well enough to provide substantive criticism and suggestions. Engels also served as Karl's link to practical political movements when Karl's health prevented direct involvement. Karl's relationship with his grandchildren provided him with personal joy that balanced the frustrations of declining health and unfinished work. He delighted in telling them stories and teaching them games, finding in their innocence and energy a reminder of human possibilities that his political analysis sometimes obscured. The children called him More, a nickname that acknowledged his dark complexion while expressing their affection for their grandfather. The question that increasingly preoccupied Karl during these years was whether his theoretical work would survive his death and continue to influence political movements toward revolutionary change. How could ideas developed through decades of research and analysis be transmitted to future generations of activists who would face different political conditions and challenges? The winter of 1881 brought the Marx household face to face with mortality in ways that would reshape Karl's final years. Jenny's liver condition, which had troubled her for several years, was worsening rapidly despite the best medical care that Karl could afford. The woman who had shared his political journey from their youthful engagement in Germany through decades of exile and poverty was now confined to bed for increasingly long periods, requiring constant care and attention. Karl's devotion to Jenny during her final illness revealed the deep personal love that had sustained their partnership through 40 years of political struggle and economic hardship. He would spend hours sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from novels and newspapers, massaging her hands when pain made sleep impossible, and managing household tasks that she could no longer perform. His own health problems seemed insignificant compared to Jenny's suffering, and he pushed himself to provide whatever comfort and support he could offer. Jenny's death on December 6, 1881 devastated Karl in ways that surprised even his closest friends. He had always been emotional about personal relationships despite his reputation for analytical coldness in political matters, but Jenny's death seemed to break something fundamental in his character. Engels described Karl after the funeral as a man whose inner light had been extinguished, someone who had lost not just a companion, but his primary reason for continuing to struggle. The practical arrangements surrounding Jenny's death highlighted the family's continued financial vulnerability despite their improved circumstances. Karl had to borrow money to pay for medical care and funeral expenses, a reminder that their comfort remained precarious and dependent on Engels's continued generosity. The irony of the situation was not lost on Karl. The man who had analyzed capitalism's treatment of human labor as a commodity found himself unable to afford dignified care for his dying wife. Karl's grief was compounded by his recognition that Jenny had sacrificed her own ambitions and possibilities to support his political and intellectual work. She had been an intelligent and capable woman who might have achieved recognition in her own right if she had not devoted herself to managing their household and supporting his research. Her death forced Karl to confront the personal costs of his single-minded dedication to revolutionary theory and practice. The months following Jenny's death saw a marked decline in Karl's physical and mental health. His skin condition worsened. He suffered from chronic bronchitis and other respiratory problems, and he seemed to lose interest in the theoretical work that had previously absorbed his attention. Friends who visited him during this period described a man who had aged dramatically, whose energy for intellectual combat had been replaced by resignation and melancholy. Karl's correspondence from 1882 shows him struggling to find motivation for completing the remaining volumes of Das Kapital. The theoretical problems that had once excited him now seemed overwhelming, requiring energy and concentration that he could no longer sustain. He would begin working on manuscript revisions only to abandon them after a few pages, frustrated by his inability to achieve the clarity and precision that had characterized his earlier work. The family's concern about Karl's declining condition led to several attempts to improve his health through travel and rest. He spent time at health resorts in Germany and took trips to warmer climates in hopes that change of environment might restore his energy. These travels provided temporary relief from his depression, but failed to address the fundamental grief and exhaustion that were undermining his health. Karl's relationship with his daughters became more important than ever during this period, as they provided emotional support and practical assistance that helped him manage daily life. Eleanor, the youngest, moved back into the family home to care for her father, managing his correspondence and helping organize his research materials. Her devotion provided Karl with comfort while also ensuring that his papers and manuscripts would be preserved for future publication. Engels visited regularly and tried to encourage Karl to continue his theoretical work, understanding that intellectual activity might help restore his sense of purpose. However, Engels also recognized that Karl's grief was too deep to be overcome through willpower alone. Their conversations during this period focused less on theoretical questions than on memories of their shared political journey and concern for the future of socialist movements that had been influenced by Karl's work. Karl's last public political statement was a letter supporting Russian revolutionaries who were facing government repression. The letter showed that despite his personal difficulties, Karl retained his commitment to revolutionary change and his faith in the possibility of socialist transformation. He remained convinced that his theoretical analysis would eventually contribute to practical political movements, even if he would not live to see their success. The winter of 1882-83 brought a series of health crises that made clear that Karl's life was drawing to a close. His bronchitis worsened into pneumonia, and his weakened constitution could not fight off the infection effectively. He spent much of the winter confined to bed, cared for by Eleanor, and attended by doctors who could do little beyond making him comfortable. Karl's final weeks were marked by periods of lucidity, alternating with confusion and exhaustion. He would sometimes dictate letters to political associates, expressing concern about theoretical questions or political developments, but these efforts tired him quickly and had to be abandoned. More often, he would simply lie quietly, occasionally smiling at Eleanor's attempts to distract him with news from the outside world. Engels's daily visits during Karl's final illness provided continuity with their lifelong friendship and political collaboration. Even when Karl was too weak to engage in conversation, Engels would sit beside his bed and discuss political developments or theoretical questions, maintaining the intellectual dialogue that had sustained their partnership for 4 decades. These visits reassured Karl that his work would continue through Engels's work, that the ideas they had developed together would survive to influence future political movements. What legacy would Karl leave behind when death finally came? How would the ideas developed through decades of research and analysis continue to shape human understanding of society, economics, and the possibilities for revolutionary change? On the afternoon of March 14, 1883, Karl Marx died peacefully in his armchair at 41 Maitland Park Road, where the family had moved after Jenny's death. Eleanor found him there when she returned from a brief errand, his head resting against the chair's back, his face calm and free from the pain that had marked his final months. He was 64 years old, and according to Engels, who arrived shortly after Eleanor's discovery, Karl had died as he had lived, thinking. The immediate aftermath of Karl's death revealed both the modest circumstances in which he had lived and the international scope of his intellectual influence. The funeral, held 3 days later at Highgate Cemetery, was attended by only 11 people, reflecting Karl's deliberate distance from public prominence and the fact that many of his political associates lived in other countries. Yet the letters and telegrams that arrived from across Europe and America demonstrated that his ideas had travelled far beyond the confines of his London exile. Engels delivered the graveside eulogy, speaking to the small gathering about Karl's contributions to human understanding of history and society. On the 14th of March, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to think, Engels began, his voice heavy with the weight of personal loss and historical significance. He compared Karl's discovery of the law of development of human history to Darwin's discovery of the law of development of organic nature, placing his friend's work within the broader context of 19th century scientific achievement. The simplicity of Karl's burial arrangements reflected both his family's continued financial constraints and his own preference for substance over ceremony. He was buried in the same grave where Jenny had been laid to rest 15 months earlier, a modest plot in Highgate Cemetery's newer section that would later become a pilgrimage site for socialists from around the world. The headstone bore only their names and dates, with no indication of the revolutionary ideas that had shaped their lives. Eleanor Marx's grief at her father's death was compounded by her recognition that she had lost not only a parent, but also her primary intellectual, mentor and political guide. She had served as Karl's secretary and companion during his final years, helping manage his correspondence and organizing his research materials. Her intimate knowledge of his work and methods would prove crucial for preserving and organizing the massive collection of manuscripts, notebooks, and letters that constituted his intellectual legacy. Engels faced the enormous task of organizing and completing Karl's unfinished work, particularly the second and third volumes of Das Kapital. The manuscripts were voluminous but incomplete, containing brilliant insights mixed with fragmentary notes and multiple drafts of the same arguments. Engels spent the remaining 12 years of his own life editing and preparing these materials for publication, a labor of love that ensured Karl's economic analysis would reach future generations in systematic form. The immediate reception of news about Karl's death varied dramatically across different political and intellectual circles. Conservative newspapers dismissed him as a failed revolutionary whose ideas had been discredited by his own poverty and political irrelevance. Liberal publications acknowledged his intellectual contributions while criticizing his political conclusions. Socialist newspapers mourned the loss of their most important theorist, while celebrating the continued vitality of the movements he had helped inspire. Karl's influence on European socialist movements was already substantial at the time of his death, but it would grow exponentially in the decades that followed. German social democrats had adopted many of his theoretical insights. French socialists were studying Das Kapital to understand capitalism's development in their country, and Russian revolutionaries were debating how his analysis applied to their pre-industrial society. His ideas were spreading through study groups, political organizations, and informal networks of radical intellectuals. The publication of the second volume of Das Kapital in 1885 and the third volume in 1894 expanded understanding of Karl's theoretical system and demonstrated the scope of his economic analysis. These volumes addressed questions about circulation, reproduction, and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall that had puzzled economists for decades. Engels's editorial work made these complex arguments accessible to readers who lacked extensive training in economic theory. The establishment of socialist political parties across Europe in the 1880s and 1890s provided institutional frameworks for spreading Karl's ideas among working-class audiences. Party schools taught simplified versions of his economic theory. Party newspapers explained current events using his analytical methods, and party leaders justified their political positions by reference to his theoretical insights. Karl's ideas were becoming not just intellectual curiosities, but practical tools for political organization. The transformation of Karl's ideas from revolutionary theory into academic subject matter began almost immediately after his death, as universities across Europe started offering courses on socialist thought and economic theory. This academic attention brought new audiences to Karl's work, but also raised questions about whether scholarly analysis might diminish the revolutionary implications of his ideas. Could theoretical insights develop to guide revolutionary practice maintain their critical edge when studied as historical artifacts? Karl's personal papers, preserved by Eleanor and later by Engels, provided evidence of the human dimensions of his intellectual work. His letters to Jenny revealed the deep, personal love that had sustained their partnership through decades of political struggle. His correspondence with Engels demonstrated the collaborative nature of their theoretical development. His notebooks showed the painstaking research methods that had produced his systematic analysis of capitalism. The mythologization of Karl Marx began almost immediately after his death, as various political movements claimed his legacy while interpreting his ideas to support different strategic approaches. Some emphasized his economic analysis and its scientific pretensions, others focused on his political writings and their revolutionary implications. These different interpretations would eventually produce competing Marxist traditions that often contradicted each other while claiming theoretical legitimacy from Karl's work. The 20th century would see Karl's ideas implemented in revolutionary movements across the globe, from the Russian Revolution to Chinese communism to liberation movements in Africa and Latin America. These movements often adapted his theoretical insights to local conditions that differed dramatically from the European capitalism he had analyzed, raising questions about the universality of his conclusions and the relationship between theory and practice. The irony of Karl Marx's posthumous influence was that the man who had lived in obscurity and died in relative poverty became one of history's most influential thinkers. His ideas shaped not only revolutionary movements but also academic disciplines, government policies, and popular understanding of how economic systems affect human social life. The theoretical insights developed in the British Museum reading room and refined through decades of political struggle had become tools for understanding social change across different cultures and historical periods. Karl's grave at Highgate Cemetery became a pilgrimage site for socialists and curious visitors from around the world. In 1956, a larger monument was erected featuring a bronze bust and the famous inscription from his theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This monument transformed Karl's resting place from a modest family grave into a symbol of revolutionary aspiration. The question that continues to fascinate scholars and activists more than a century after Karl's death is whether his theoretical analysis successfully bridged the gap between understanding the world and changing it. Did his ideas provide effective tools for revolutionary transformation, or did they remain trapped within the intellectual categories they sought to transcend? The debates over Karl Marx's legacy reflect ongoing struggles over how human beings can consciously shape their social conditions rather than simply adapting to forces beyond their control. Today, Karl Marx's ideas continue to influence academic research, political movements, and popular understanding of capitalism's effects on human social life. His theoretical insights about commodity production, class struggle, and historical development remain relevant for analyzing contemporary economic and political developments. The man who spent his life analyzing capitalism's contradictions left behind intellectual tools that continue to illuminate how economic systems shape human possibilities for freedom and fulfillment. In the quiet of Highgate Cemetery, where Karl Marx lies buried beside his beloved Jenny, visitors still come to pay respects to the revolutionary thinker whose ideas outlived their creator. The modest grave has become a place of pilgrimage for those who continue to believe that human beings can understand their social conditions well enough to change them. Karl's legacy is not just his theoretical contributions, but his example of a life devoted to the conviction that careful analysis of existing society can contribute to its revolutionary transformation. The boring details of Karl Marx's daily life, his routine research sessions, his financial struggles, his family relationships, his health problems, reveal the human dimensions of intellectual work that changed how people understand their social world. Behind the revolutionary theory was a man who lived through the ordinary challenges of making a living, raising a family, and maintaining hope despite repeated disappointments. His story reminds us that ideas capable of changing the world emerge from lives lived with patience, determination, and faith in human possibilities for creating more just and free societies.